Guys, I have a runny nose, a throat infection, and a high fever. So you can say I'm not in really good shape. But by the end of this video, we're going to put the Danish Gambit in an even worse shape. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the Danish starts off to the move e4, e5, d4. We capture the pawn and they give the second pawn with c3. Now the main line actually goes with d takes c3. They bring their bishop out. C takes b2 and bishop takes b2. Here you can see that the bishops have an open diagonal. Even the knights can develop very comfortably to f3 and c3, sometimes even e2. And you can see that the queen and the bishop is going to put a lot of pressure on this king. Black has not developed at all, so it will find quite difficult to survive the upcoming attack. Although computers say that it's still survivable and is still okay for black, but I don't really think that we should go or aim for such a position. So what do I recommend instead? Well, instead of taking this pawn, the second pawn with d takes c3, I recommend that we play the move queen e7. Now let me just tell you a little bit about this move. So the move queen e7 actually attacks this particular pawn on e4, and whenever white sees this particular move for the first time, they have two reactions. The first one is, okay, let me just protect my pawn because they're attacking it. And the second reaction is, okay, I'm gonna give up my pawn in the most favorable circumstances possible. So let's look at the first option where white tries to protect the pawn. Now they can protect the pawn in many different ways. So one of them could be queen e2, bishop d3, f3, knight d2. They can even take the pawn and protect it. There are several ways to do that. So let's look at each of them in turn. First, we will start with the most common move, which is bishop to d3. Now after bishop d3, we strike the pawn with d5, immediately putting extra pressure on this particular pawn and asking white to do something about it. Now, the two most common moves over here are essentially they either push the pawn with e5 or they try to protect the pawn with queen e2. Let's have a look at both of them. So let's look at e5 first. We take the pawn, we check, knight e2, and now they simply want to castle. Over here we play bishop d6. Now obviously they cannot castle because of mate on h2, so they have to do something else. What they do is they generally capture the pawn. After queen f6, now they can play knight b to c3, threatening our pawn over here. We play c3, and now finally they can castle because there's no mate on h2 now. Over here I recommend the move knight e7. They can play something like knight g3, castles. Knight h5 is a tricky move. Now over here we are threatening two moves. We are threatening to take the pawn, and we are also threatening to come to h4 and put more pressure on the h2 pawn. In this situation, white has a tricky move, which is knight h5, which I just showed you. Queen h4, g3. We still can't take the knight because of the queen. Queen g4. And now over here, generally they have played the move bishop e2. And after we go back with queen g6, if they try to chase our queen, we have bishop f5. And I don't really see what's the problem with this position for black. Black is very solid. And in the next move, after let's say trading the bishop, they're going to bring out their second knight to a very natural square, which is f6, and also challenge this particular knight. The knight will have to either trade itself or have to go somewhere else, and this is a really good position, and the long-term weakness of this pawn will remain. And you should also remember that we are simply a pawn up in this particular position, so it's a good position to be in. So e5 can actually lead to this kind of stuff. So what if they try to overprotect their pawn with queen e2? After queen e2, I suggest that we take, bishop takes. If they take with the queen, we simply chop the queen off and exchange, and then we are one step closer to just enjoying our extra pawn. So they try to keep as much material as possible. After bishop e4, knight f6, we're threatening the bishop. Now they can go either knight d2 or they can go bishop d3. Let's have a look at bishop d3 first. After bishop d3, I simply suggest that we play knight f6. Knight f3, bishop g4, castle, castle, bishop g5, and simply queen d7 here. And I don't really see what's the problem with this position again. There are not many tricks or anything like that. The knight is pinned. The pawn is actually pinned to the bishop. There's a lot of pressure here. There's a lot of pressure here. So you can understand that this is a very favorable position for black. I think black might just be winning in this position also because of this strong pin down the center. So that is one thing that can happen with bishop d3 if they go back. But what if they go knight to d2, still trying to protect that pawn? Well, we start chopping off pieces. You play knight c6, knight f3, bishop f5, trying to pressure the center again, trying to pressure the central piece again, knight g3, and now we simply chop off, play bishop g4, and we castle. Now this is a simple extra pawn. The king is out in the center, although it's an endgame, a queenless middle game, or you can say, so it shouldn't be that big of a problem, but we can simply hope to enjoy our extra pawn in this particular position, and I don't really see how white can cause us any significant problems here. So that was for the most common move, which is bishop to d3. Now let's have a look at something else. Let's try another way to protect the pawn, which is knight to d2. Now knight to d2 should be fairly simple to deal with. The whole idea was, when we capture their pawn on c3, to capture back with the knight and develop it in its most natural place. So now when the knight has already gone to d2, we can simply capture this pawn. And they have to recapture back with the pawn, and that's really not what they wanted. Also, the bishop can no longer use this long diagonal because of the pawn, and it's not a really good place to be in. After d5, let me just show you one way that I've won a pretty simple game. Bishop d3 takes, knight e4, and simply f5, and we are simply winning the piece in this position. So that is for knight d2, not a really strong contender to be a good move. What else can they play? Well, they can protect it with queen e2, which is a very interesting line. Now for queen e2, I suggest that we simply play knight c6. And well, no Danish player in their right minds will actually take the pawn and allow us to develop our knight with tempo on the queen. Although that's a nice way to go about it also. What they generally try to do after knight c6 is to protect their d4 pawn with knight f3, and hoping to simply recapture the pawn someday to be able to build a strong center. Now here I suggest that we play the move knight f6. Knight f6 has the merit of attacking the e4 pawn again, and after e5 we must be careful. Now just a standard response to move the knight away, let's say to d5, would not be good, because after c takes d4, white has a brilliant, beautiful center in the middle, and okay, we can try to chip away at it using something like f6 or d6, but I don't really fancy the positions that arise after this, because even we are weakening our own king in the center. So instead of this, whenever they play e5 in this particular position, you have to remember this fantastic move, which is d3. It's counter-attacking their queen. So let's have a look at a few of the variations. One simple variation is if they try to chop off everything. That doesn't really work for them. We take their queen, they take our queen, and now we take their bishop, but with check. So they don't have the time to take our bishop with check. So in this particular variation, we are simply a pawn up, and they cannot castle kingside anymore. It will take them some time to castle queenside, and I don't really see where the compensation lies for white. So they cannot do this crazy checker-like variation of capturing everything. What else can they do? If they try to play queen takes d3, we simply capture the knight back, and now we are threatening a discovered attack with the knight. So they generally capture back. They play bishop e2, bishop c5, castle, castle, and again we can simply hope to enjoy our extra pawn in this position. So queen takes d3 also is not really good. One interesting attempt is to keep the queen on the e file using queen e3, but here we try to hit it again with knight g4, and now the queen doesn't really have any sensible place to go to. Even if they drop back here, our response is going to be pretty much the same. So let's say if they take the pawn, now we simply go knight from c takes e5, knight takes e5, and here we can take back with the knight, but I suggest that we go simply with queen takes e5, bishop e2, bishop c5. Obviously they cannot castle here because of the mate on h2. But you'll be surprised. On leeches alone, I found at least 10 players who have fallen for this cheapo. So in quick games, some things like this can actually happen. So after bishop c5, bishop e3, let's say we chop it off, and after bishop takes e3, the bishop actually controls the diagonal, and white king will find it extremely difficult to castle. Let's say they try to cover and try to castle queenside. Sure, d5, castles, bishop f5, queen b5 check, let's say, c3, and let's say if they want to take our b7 pawn, fine, we castle. And now this is a horrible position for white. The bishops are controlling the key diagonals, especially this bishop on f5. It will be very difficult for white to, arrange a challenge with this bishop of this one. And as long as it stays, this particular king is not going to feel safe. Also, this pawn on c3 should probably be back on c2, and that will make the queenside castle a much more safer place to be. And with our rook coming in with b8, and there are potential sacrifices on b2 looming, this is a very favorable position for black. So this is the kind of stuff that can happen with the queen e2 variation. So let's try to go back. What else can they do to protect the pawn? Let's try the move f3. After f3, we go with our standard way of d5, trying to put more pressure here. Now, here we are at a crossroads. They can try to protect it again with d3, bishop d3, or they can try to simply take our pawn with the queen and try to get over with it. Let's have a look at bishop d3 first. After bishop d3, you know the drill. We capture and we play knight c6, knight f3, bishop g4, castle and castle. Black is safe enough. We have already castled. We have a pressure on the d file. And now, since we are well developed and castle, white's development advantage is not going to be that great. And in the next move, we are simply threatening to capture the pawn over here. So with that in mind, I think this is a very comfortable position for black. So let's say instead of bishop d3, they try to capture our pawn with queen d4. Cool. It may seem logical. It may seem tempting to play knight c6 here, but that simply allows queen takes d5. So instead, I'm recommending that we play knight f6, putting a lot of pressure on the e4 pawn. If they try to push it, which they have done in the past, knight c6 is an important move here. Again, with knight c6, you are threatening this pawn again. So bishop to b5 has been a common move. And now black can simply play bishop d7, try to get away with the pin, but I don't recommend that. I recommend a far more stronger move, which basically puts a lot of pressure on white and gives them the chance to make mistakes. And that is the move knight to d7. Now after knight to d7, we are doing two things. We are first of all preventing any pin on the c6 knight. And there are two ways that white has actually dealt with this situation. One is to simply capture the knight on c6, and the other one is to capture the pawn now on d5, which has now become undefended. Let's have a look at both of them. So let's say they capture the pawn on d5. Here we capture with the knight on c5, or on c file. So now we are threatening a discovered attack on the king, and the most logical way that white has dealt with this is simply to capture back, and we capture back with the bishop on d7. Here we are threatening to castle and play bishop c6, which will put white in a pretty precarious position. Here they have tried knight to e2, trying to basically block the e file to prevent any discovered checks. Here after castle, they should remain very vigilant. A really common move that has been played is castle. Well, what else do you want to do? And after bishop c6, it's already lost for white, because this particular knight can no longer be defended. After something like queen a5, knight takes f3, check, and we simply capture the knight. And this is a very comfortable position for black, because the white king side has been shattered and their pieces are actually underdeveloped, and we are having a lot of good moves to play. Even something like bishop c5 after the queen is kicked out or something can be really strong. So that is something that they can't really do. So taking the pawn is not really good. Taking the knight with the bishop is also not really that great. Here I'll show you another trap. So after takes f4, because we were threatening the e5 pawn, here we simply start pressurizing the pawn again. They try to protect it, and here comes the sneaky move, queen e6. And now we're threatening two things. We're threatening bishop c5, and we're also threatening bishop a6, preventing white from castling here. And I cannot tell you how many people have actually fallen into this trap of simply castle and losing their queen. Sometimes it might just be oversight, but this has happened plenty of times. So that is something that can go wrong for white. So this is a very favorable position, I would say. So f3 also can't really be recommended. So what else can they play after this? Well, they can try to simply take the pawn with the queen and defend their pawn in a much more direct way. Let's see what to do after this. After queen takes d4, we play knight c6, simply gaining a tempo on the queen. And although several moves have been played, queen to e3 seems the most logical and also is probably objectively the better move. Simply taking ideas from the center game where the queen sits comfortably on e3. Here we try to pressure the pawn again with knight f6. Bishop d3, d5, knight d2 is simply going down that same road. We are pressurizing the pawn and white is trying to prevent anything bad from happening. There is another move in this situation, which is e takes d5, but we'll have a look at it later. Let's have a look at the natural move of simply overprotecting their pawn. Here we chop it off, and now we can play the move knight g4. Generally, they don't want to give up their bishop. If they do that, we can simply capture and win the bishop pair for nothing. So they generally try to take back with the knight, and here we play knight g4. The queen has to move somewhere. Queen e2 seems the most logical. They don't want to move away from the e file and allow this kind of stuff to happen. So generally moving on the e file is a much better idea. And here we reroute the knight to e5. So knight g to e5. And after something like bishop c2, bishop e6, this is a very comfortable position for black. Again, now we are threatening this particular move here, which is bishop to c4, which is putting more pressure here and also allows some knight forks, knight jumps to d3. So b3 has been a common way to protect it, and we simply castle. And if they play a move like f5, we can simply drop the knight back, and then we are even closer to playing our own f5 here. So if they play f4, I meant. So knight f3 is a common thing that they do, and it's actually a mistake, because after we capture back, this pin on the e file will be very decisive, and a mistake here would be the most natural move, which is queen takes f3, because after f5 it's already pretty painful. If the knight moves somewhere, we have these bishop checks, and we might win the queen, or we might just win a lot of material for nothing. So sometimes it can go wrong for white really early on. So I was talking about the other move, where instead of overprotecting their pawn, they actually try to just get rid of the tension really quickly by playing the move e takes d5. Sure, here we can take back, and after something like takes and takes, we could be okay in this particular position, but I don't recommend that, because, or let's say even bishop takes e7. And I don't really like this position because, okay, we are not up a pawn or anything like that, and white's development is not really bad, but also black doesn't have anything, substantial. Although even from this position, white doesn't really have a good score, and I can probably attribute that to just the psychological damage that has happened. So white wanted to play the Danish Gambit, they wanted to be aggressive, and they are not going to get any of that. The queens have just been traded, and that already puts them in a lost or kind of a defensive mindset. And black has scored above average from this particular position. But no, if we are learning opening theory, we should put the maximum amount of pressure on the opponent, and we should not look at simply lines where we are getting equality when actually we could have gotten more. So after e takes d5, knight to e5 is the move that we should probably play. And knight e5 has the option of keeping more tension in the center and also trying to gain the bishop pair. So it's trying to aim for some advantage, and later we can obviously capture the pawn on d5. Over here is the most critical line where they try to check. Now it already gives them a feeling of the fried liver attack. So after c6, d takes c6, b takes c6, and bishop e2, because, well, there are some checks looming here now because of the discovered check. So bishop e2. Now comes the knight dance. Knight f to g4. Bishop takes g4. And now we are threatening this particular discovered check. Over here, the queen will not be able to take because it's pinned. So the white king will be misplaced. So knight to e2 seems like a very logical move. After rook to d8, again we are threatening this check. Let's say the castle. And here we play this extremely strong move, rook d3. And this is already looking very problematic for white. After something like queen to e4, we can actually just take the knight. And if they try to recapture it, obviously knight to f3 wins the queen, because it's a check on the queen, and even if the queen takes back, we can simply take it with the rook. Another move would be to play rook e1, and here comes this fantastic shot, which is rook d1. Absolutely brilliant. So something like queen e2 again fails to rook e1 and knight f3 check, and again you lose the queen here. So things like this can happen in this variation. It seems like a fried liver gone wrong for white. So this is the kind of fun that you can get in this particular variation, where they try to protect their pawn with queen takes d4. Now, although there are still some more ways to protect the e4 pawn, something like queen f3, queen c2, but I don't really recommend that you spend too much of your time trying to understand the logic of that. Let's say queen f3, we simply play d5, and we have our similar positions that we saw in the other variations. So that was it for this video. Final video, we will check two other options, or maybe like three other options, where white decides to give up their pawn on e4 under favorable circumstances. So we'll be looking at the moves like bishop c4, knight f3, and, well, c takes d4. So stay tuned for that video. It comes out next week. I hope I'll be better health-wise in that particular position, so I'll be able to be slightly more enthusiastic this time.
So if you got some value from that, consider hitting the subscribe button. It really helps me out, and you also get to be notified about the future uploads that I do. And while you're at it, have a look at these other two videos, which I think you might find really interesting. Until next time.